So good morning again. My name is Jim Jaeger. I know many of you in the congregation today, but for those of you who don't know me, I've been a member of this congregation for about 25 years. I am a student at the Meadville Lombard Theological School in Chicago. Spent the last year in La Crosse as a chaplain resident at Gunderson Lutheran Hospital, and I'm now a candidate for the Unitarian Universalist ministry. Some more of my story will come out in the course of the sermon this morning, but I'm very pleased to be here and in this pulpit and in this beautiful meeting house. About 25 years ago, I was sitting in what we now call the Landmark Auditorium on the Sunday before Labor Day. I'd been a member of First Unitarian Society for a year or so and was sure that I had made the right choice of spiritual homes. At the time, we had lived in Madison for about 7 years. I was a shareholder in a medium-sized law firm doing work that was interesting, at least most of the time, and was certainly financially rewarding. While I was not getting rich, I was making a comfortable living. I was 40 years old, had a family to raise. But inside, there was a sense of disquiet. I did not feel energetic about going to work each day. The work I was doing, business law and tax and estate planning, was intellectually stimulating, but much of the time it was not satisfying to the soul. On a personal level, I liked the people I worked with, but we had different values, a fact that became clearer as I participated in the life of this community and began to think about what was really important to me. In a sense, the first part of my personal journey was what had brought me to First Unitarian Society in the first place. While the reasons for our family joining FUS are somewhat lost in the mist of family history, the result for me was personally significant. Reverend John Burens, former president of the Unitarian Universalist Association, has referred to Unitarian Universalism as a chosen faith. Growing up, I was a Lutheran. Not because I had studied all the religious alternatives and decided that Luther had it right, but because that was the religion of my parents, and their parents, and their parents. You get my drift. Unitarian Universalism for me was different. While I did not do the extensive research that many seekers do today, this was during those ancient times when the internet was in its infancy. Worshiping at FUS and getting a sense of what Unitarian Universalism was all about was enough for me. I joined up. I chose Unitarian Universalism. But this was not the only door that opened up. I began to think subconsciously or consciously about other doors in my life. At this time, I'd been out of law school for about 13 years. I figured I had about 25 or more years of law practice ahead of me, and at that point, I could not honestly say that I was happy or satisfied. And so I was open to Michael's message that Sunday morning. I can't say that I remember exactly what he said, but the message I recall was that our vocation is an important part of who we are, and that we need to match our vocation to our values. Another part of the message that I heard that day was that at times we must take some risks in our life if we're going to find the place where we are meant to be. I didn't immediately act on the message. It had to stir around in my head for a while. But a few months later, I began actively exploring alternatives to my current situation. One dream that I had in law school was to have my own small practice. One of my buddies and I had talked about hanging out the proverbial shingle after we graduated. Instead, we both ended up getting real jobs and went our separate ways. As my search progressed, I had looked at a lot of different possibilities. I finally found 2 other lawyers who had a small practice on the east side. I had known them over the years, though not well, but they had the small family-oriented practice that I felt would be a good fit for me. And so in July of 1990, 9 years to the day after I started practicing in Madison, I joined these two men with whom I was destined to practice law for the next 22 years. As it turned out, this became a bigger change for me than I'd initially anticipated. Through a series of events, I began practicing in the newly developing area of elder law. Excuse me. This was a new practice paradigm in which the identity of the client, elderly persons or persons with disabilities or their families, rather than the technical areas of the law, were central. We worked with families dealing with the shadow side of aging, the need for advanced medical directives, paying for long-term care, victimization by elder abuse. Our practice was holistic, looking not only at the legal and financial, but also at the social and psychological aspects of our clients' circumstances. The substance of the law was challenging, and the sense of personal satisfaction for the practice was great, at least most of the time. And elder law attorneys are a lot like Unitarian Universalists. In fact, I learned that many of them are Unitarian Universalists. They have a sense of mission, the idea that our practice would somehow make a difference in the lives of our clients. And like many Unitarian Universalists of my generation, elder law attorneys have come from somewhere else, from some other area of the law. We came to elder law because it would make us feel good and allow us to do good. So I made the change. It was risky, though I was fortunate to have a spouse who was supportive in more ways than one. She had a job in the schools with good benefits, including health insurance. And new law partners who took me in without much of a guarantee of how much revenue I would bring to the table. But it was a gamble nonetheless. Now, what I did in 1990 is not too different from what many individuals do in middle age, what probably many of you have done. The job or vocation that we chose fresh out of college met our needs at that time. We needed the security or structure to learn our skills and make personal and professional contacts. We needed room to develop personal relationships, and for some of us to start our families. But by midlife, things had changed. Many of us were settled in our professional lives, or because of a changing economy or personal circumstances, we needed to start over. For many of us at that stage in life, we wanted or needed more from our vocation. We needed more challenge, more meaning, more satisfaction than our current job or career was providing. If we were in the right circumstances, we're privileged to have a supportive network, or we're simply crazy enough to try something new, this was the time of our life where we often make a move. Now, data from the Bureau of Labor Statistics indicate that the average time that we stay in one job is 4.1 years. This was as of 2008. I'm curious what those data look like after the recession. From this data, some extrapolate that we could have as many as 7 careers in our working lifetime. Now, this does not mean that we change careers every time we change a job, or that we have to change jobs to change careers. My law practice involved only 3 different employers, but many changes during my career. However, it does mean that we have to be prepared to deal with vocational change during our working lives. For many people, the Great Recession accelerated that change as old jobs simply disappeared and were not necessarily replaced by new ones. And it means that we must be engaged in constant lifelong learning. As I shifted my practice to focus on elder law, there was much that I had to learn, both in the substantive areas of law, got to figure out a better way to do that at second service. As I shifted my practice to focus on elder law, there was much that I had to learn, both in the substantive areas of law as well as the skills needed to deal with different kinds of clients. Much of what I needed to know either was not taught in law school when I was there, or did not even exist. And of course, law is not the only vocation that faces such change. I'm sure that many of you in the auditorium this morning have had the same experience in your jobs. Now, while arbitrary, we can divide life into 4 phases. The first is the time from birth through young adulthood. This is the period of time when we grow up and prepare for the future life. The focus is on learning the skills and developing the habits for a lifetime. This is where we begin to paint on the canvas of life. The second is middle age or midlife. This is the period that I've already described. This is the time of mastery, of finding our role in the world. We are no longer the apprentices or the mentees. We are the journeyman and the master craftsman, the mentor rather than the mentee. At this point, for most at least, life has found its rhythm and they have found their role. But for many, at around age 50, we begin to ask the question, is this all there is? Is this enough? Is simply mastering the skills of our chosen vocation sufficient? Have we taken the road we really want? Or is there a road less taken that is beckoning to us? Sarah Lawrence Lightfoot calls this the time of life the 3rd chapter. According to her, the 3rd chapter is that time of life which she places in the 50 to 75-year age range, when people have achieved a sense of accomplishment but feel that there are a few more mountains to climb or rivers to cross before the final exit. Or as my friend and mentor, the Reverend Tom Owen Toll, put it in his book, Save the Males, there is time for one more large, foolish project. For me, attending seminary and pursuing professional ministry was my large, foolish project. In her book, Lawrence Lightfoot interviewed about 40 different individuals who were each living out their personal 3rd chapter. From the stories of these people, she identified several themes. I would like to look at a few of them and apply them to my personal story. The first she calls loss and liberation, where we have to let go of the familiar, the routine, the daily ritual, and give up our current status to embrace the new and the unfamiliar. By the 3rd chapter, we are probably fairly accomplished at what we are doing. One of the 3rd chapter changes is to give that all up. My story resumes about 15 years from where I left off earlier. By this time, I had an established elder law practice. I was an adjunct professor at the University of Wisconsin Law School and had frankly achieved some degree of professional recognition at both the state and nationwide. Yet I was still not satisfied. I had again reached the point where I was no longer going to work with the same enthusiasm as I had before. I was still providing my clients with competent and compassionate legal services, but there was something missing. I just didn't have the same fire. For several years, as I became more involved at First Unitarian Society, as well as the District and Continental Unitarian Universalist Association level, I found a pull, dare I say a call, to ministry. And while I could argue that my law practice and my service to the Unitarian Universalism in this congregation were in fact a ministry, I was drawn to attending seminary and becoming ordained. This was not a new thing for me. When I went to Luther College in 1966, I intended to become a Lutheran minister. That faded as I realized that I was no longer comfortable with the theology of the Lutheran Church. Thus, Lutheran ministry really didn't seem like the right career choice. But since embracing Unitarian Universalism in the late 1980s, the ministry itch returned. And so after much consideration and discernment and discussions with my wife and friends and others who had gone on this journey, I enrolled in Meadville Lombard Theological School in a program designed for part-time second career types such as myself. Since I had 2 graduate degrees at this point, I thought I knew what I was getting into. Boy, was I wrong. I began to suspect that there was more to it when they started talking about something they called ministerial formation. As I began to learn about and experience this process, I realized it was more than getting a Master's of Divinity degree. It was a process of taking one's life apart and putting it back together. Now, it would have been one thing to do this at age 25. It was quite another to try it at age 55, with the knowledge that I would probably be 65 or older before I would actually begin the practice of ministry. Having been used to being the expert, the mentor, the teacher, all of a sudden I was now the neophyte, the learner, the beginner. Many of my senior college were much younger than I, some being the age of my own children. My academic advisor at Meadville, a brilliant young theologian, was only a couple of years older than my oldest son. And they knew much more than I did, both academically and about the practice of ministry. This came into even starker relief when I did my first unit of clinical pastoral education, or chaplaincy training. CPE, as we call it, is an intense, intentional process requiring that the students take a deep look at themselves and how they relate to the world. Many of this involved dealing with our own emotions, something that this left-brained, rational, humanist lawyer wasn't very good at. So the first thing I had to learn as part of my third chapter was humility, and to accept that it was okay to admit that I didn't know everything, that I had much to learn. The second lesson that Lawrence Lightfoot identifies as part of the third chapter is the changing face of aging, at least in North America. No longer is retirement necessarily the time to move to the retirement community and spend your days on the golf course and your evenings with your feet up on the coffee table drinking mint juleps. I'm not really sure I know what a mint julep is. The third chapter, retirees of this generation tend to be healthier, better educated, and less interested in retiring to a life of leisure. For many, by necessity or design, there is a desire to remain engaged with the world, including the world of work. For me, one of the blessings of joining and becoming active in First Unitarian Society has been to get to know people older than I. There are going to be fewer of those who are older than I. Many of these persons are superb role models for graceful and engaged aging. In our society that is so often the age segregated, a religious community is one of the few places where people of all ages and life situations interact naturally. These older folks at FUS inspired me to look upon growing older as an opportunity and a challenge rather than something to dread. In the third chapter, we also often find that we need to revisit the hurts of our past and come to terms with them. We must, in Lawrence Lightfoot's words, journey home and confront the ancient traumas of our childhoods. As we explore our earlier years, we find that aging gives us more perspective on how our families of origin have continued to impact us as adults. The third chapter can be a time of discernment. We can look at our parents and siblings with more understanding and more grace. Having been parents ourselves or significant adults in others' lives, we are often more understanding and forgiving of our parents' faults and our own missteps in raising our children. For me, clinical pastoral education was a central part of my ministerial formation. In addition to the first unit at Meriter Hospital in 2007, I recently completed a clinical pastoral education residency at Gunderson Lutheran Hospital in La Crosse. This was a 12-month program combining intense group work, individual supervision, and clinical practice. In addition to training us in the practical skills of pastoral care and giving us an opportunity to practice those skills, the individual and group work forced us to look at ourselves intensely and deeply. A significant part of this work involved our families of origin and how they impacted who we are today. We looked at several generations of our own families and tried to come to terms with where we fit in or didn't fit in, and how those early experiences shaped our adulthood. We looked at family systems theory to understand more generally how families function and impact their members. Now, not everyone in the third chapter has an opportunity to do a systematic review of his or her family and childhood experiences. But Lawrence Lightfoot concludes that most of us explore those themes as we progress through our third chapter. Having looked back on their earlier years, Lawrence Lightfoot suggests that persons living out the third chapter want to turn the tables, rewrite their priorities, reinvest in their relationships, recalibrate the meaning of success, even re-envision their concept of work. Having prepared for a career in the first chapter and gained expertise and often recognition in the second, the third chapter is the time to pay it forward. This is the time to take the skills we have learned and use them to address the challenges facing the world. Having less need to work for economic sustenance, the third chapter is a time when we can take our skills to try to make the world a better place in a different way. Now, while I was fortunate to have had a job that sustained my spirit and allowed me to get back, as I get older, I found the role I was playing too often impeded rather than promoted that goal. The job of the lawyer is to represent individual clients with individual problems. Many of the situations I confronted required a minister rather than an advocate, someone who could seek to bring the parties together or address their souls or spirits rather than simply their pocketbooks. It is my hope that I will find in ministry the vocation that will allow me to address these larger issues of life, whether in the congregation, at the bedside, or in the wider community. Finally, Lawrence Lightfoot suggests that the third chapter is a time to cross new boundaries, learn new things, develop new skills, or refine old ones that had atrophied from disuse. In her book, she cites many examples of people who revisited old passions for art, music, writing, and theater. She talks about the importance of lifelong learning and argues that as a society we must provide these opportunities. Now, some might suggest that I have taken this to an extreme, going back to seminary in my late 50s. Yet in my program, there are many of us in the same age cohort, taking advantage of our time and relative economic security to explore new vistas in our lives. Now, this does not mean that I'm a dilettante wanting to play at being a minister. I'm not ready to retire, but want to engage the world in a new way, see it from a new angle. I can assure you that the path to ministry is daunting enough, I still have the credentialing gauntlet to run, that is not for the faint of heart. But it is also exciting and a new challenge that gives new spice to my life. And finally, for me, it meets the criteria of right livelihood, described by Thich Nhat Hanh. Right livelihood is part of the Buddhist Noble Eightfold Path. It is a way of earning a living without transgressing the ideals of love and compassion. Again, much of the time I was fortunate that my law practice met this ideal, though not always. And I'm sure that ministry will have its moments as well. But one of the advantages of living in the third chapter is that I hope to have greater freedom to control how I use my time in this period of my life. With that freedom, however, comes the responsibility to use the time wisely and well. Of course, following the third chapter is the fourth chapter. Or as a friend of mine put it, the fourth quarter, from which he reminded me there was only one way out. I'll leave the question of a fifth quarter for another day. In my professional life, I have focused on issues of death and dying almost daily. As an estate planner and probate attorney, I work with folks on planning for incapacity and death. As a hospital chaplain, I spent many hours at the bedside at the time of or immediately after death. In fact, on my last Friday as a chaplain at Gunderson, I was at the bedside of a man just a few years younger than myself when he died. I know that clearly I have fewer years ahead of me than I've already lived. Last fall, I realized that 15 years had passed since the death of my father, that I was just 15 years younger than he was when he died. So none of us really know how many years we have left. However, this does not either frighten me or make me sad. It reminds me that life is impermanent and that it is up to me to make the most of it. This year, my wife and I have the fortune of having 3 of our grandchildren and their mother live with us. While living with a 3-year-old, 5-year-old, and 8-year-old in the house certainly raises the energy level, I am also reminded that they represent my personal quest for immortality. And so I face the 4th chapter with a sense of accomplishment and satisfaction. Perhaps I've grown up after all.